The last episode, number 175, was about the State Department. And I had never really looked into the State Department before because why would I? It's the State Department. It's our diplomacy wing. It's full of nerds that do the talking and they create the peace. What's to see there? Well, it turns out there's a shitload to see there. And to summarize what I discovered, it really boils down to the State Department, along with all of its do-gooder work, which is real and important and it's stuff to be proud of. But along with that work, it's also using our tax money to orchestrate the overthrow of governments by straight up buying weapons for people willing to fight governments, but also in sneakier ways, like funneling our tax money to private organizations, some literally controlled by the Republican and Democratic parties, to give to other private organizations to do God only knows what with. But we do know that the purpose is to get around restraints that have been put on our government, so it's just a whole boatload of shady. And so the last episode was a fascinating rabbit hole, and it was an incomplete one because I can tell you that the National Endowment for Democracy, which is what I highlighted, that is not the only creepy tax money funneling private fund that's in the State Department, not by a long shot. And so I do recommend that episode. But in my research for that episode, I had stumbled upon a regime change effort happening right now by us in Venezuela. And that important information was buried well over an hour into that episode. And one mistake that I made was not making that whole Venezuela thing its own episode. And so that's one mistake I'm going to fix today, because just like with Syria and Ukraine over the years, I do think it's important to have a standalone episode that we can refer back to so that newbies can get the backstory on what's going on as we continue to follow the new developments as they happen. And so that's one purpose of today's episode, but don't worry. Even though you heard some of this stuff in the last episode, there's a lot of new stuff here. The repetition is minimal. But the other reason that I needed to revisit Venezuela today is that I made a mistake by oversimplifying some events that happened in Venezuela in the last few years. Now, I know that my job here, or at least the job I've given myself, is to simplify the complicated so that all of us can understand what's going on. But I did not do a good job because in this case, that oversimplification would lead you to make an incorrect conclusion about facts on the ground. But the problem is that I can't just quickly explain the mistake in the beginning of this episode like I usually do because, like I said, it's more complicated than I made it. So the correction of my mistake is going to be in the middle of this episode. But by the end of the main portion of this episode, you will no longer have been led astray by me, and you will have a lot more information about how specifically the Trump administration and the World Trade System moles in our Congress, who are members of both parties, are actively trying to replace the government of Venezuela. And as always, I've fact-checked all of this, and you can judge my sources for yourself in this episode's show notes. I do not expect you to take my word for any of this, so please check this stuff out for yourself. I am making it as easy as I possibly can for you. And if you support this work, please visit the support page on congressionaldish.com because you're not going to hear a single advertisement because this podcast is listener-supported. But my goal here today is to tell you some of the things we are not being told by the corporate media and by those who are actively trying to replace Venezuela's government. It may sound today like I'm defending President Maduro of Venezuela and his economic system, but please understand that I really don't give a f*** about how Venezuela chooses to run its economy. All I know is that to listen to the boob tube, you would think that Venezuela is being ruled by Hitler and everyone there is dying, and that is just not the case. And so, let's get started. The first thing you need to know about Venezuela, the most important thing, because it's key to everything, is that Venezuela has the largest confirmed reserves of oil in the world. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq, more than Libya, more than Iran, Venezuela, when it comes to fossil fuels, is numero uno. Now, oil was first drilled in Venezuela way back in 1912, and when that happened, Venezuela was being governed by a military dictator who let the British multinational Royal Dutch Shell and the Rockefeller family Standard Oil into Venezuela to take the oil and sell it for a profit, with few requirements that the Venezuelan people get a cut of the money. Flash forward to the 1970s, with oil prices soaring because the Middle East countries had cut off their oil supplies to the world, the president of Venezuela at that time created a national oil company. The profits of this company would not be handed out to shareholders, who are people rich enough to bet on the company in the Wall Street casino. But instead, the money and the profits would be used, at least partially, instead of taxes to provide services that every human in Venezuela needs, like healthcare and education and homes. In the early 1980s, though, the price of oil fell. The income for the Venezuelan government being tied to the price and selling of oil meant that Venezuela found itself unable to afford the services it once could when the oil they were selling was bringing in the big bucks, a situation identical to what is happening in Venezuela today. At the end of the W. Bush years, the price of oil got up to almost $150 a barrel. Today, it's $65. And when the oil price tanked in the early 1980s, the Venezuelan president at the time took out the country's first IMF loan. Now, IMF stands for the International Monetary Fund, and the International Monetary Fund is one of the main three pillars of the economic system that I've nicknamed the World Trade System. This system was created after World War II, with the idea being that if the entire world operated under the same economic rules, then there would be no reason for war. There would be courts to work out their differences, and there would be peace. And it's not the dumbest idea, but unfortunately, the rules were written in a way that gives us peasants no role in it whatsoever. Because have you ever voted for your representative at the World Trade Organization? Yeah, me neither. They chose to set up an undemocratic system that prioritizes the needs of multinational corporations and their stockholders above everybody else. And we also have a 70-year history to look at now to see that in reality, despite all they say about spreading democracy, this system has served to force countries to allow the multinationals into the countries either through economic coercion or straight-up war. The International Monetary Fund in particular is key to the economic coercion game, although there are other so-called development banks that do this too. But basically how it works is that the IMF loans governments money but with strings attached. The strings are that the countries can only get the money if they change their economic laws to match those of the World Trade System. That always means privatizing industries. Anything that can be done for a profit should be allowed to be done for a profit, especially by the multinationals. And then social services are required to be cut. This is branded as being for responsible governance, but in effect, it makes sure that the populations are forced to work for the private companies in order to survive. Because if we are a part of the World Trade System, if it is what feeds us, then we don't bite its hand. And from the late 1980s to the late 1990s, Venezuela's president attempted the reforms required for entry into the market economy in return for the IMF cash. Venezuela's president took the IMF loans and, as demanded, eliminated rules that hindered corporate profit. He also cut social services and promised to privatize Venezuela's telecommunications infrastructure, its aluminum, steel, and chemical plants, and its electricity grid. And most importantly, the nationalized oil industry also became, let's just say, less nationalized. During this time, Venezuela's government, with its balls firmly clasped by the IMF, signed 32 operating service agreements with 22 multinational fossil fuel companies, including ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, Total, effectively giving the private sector the Venezuelan oil to profit from again. The result of the World Trade System being welcomed back into Venezuela and the government's submission to the IMF reform demands was skyrocketing poverty for the population that was now receiving less services from its government. And there were deadly protests. There was one where the military killed hundreds of people. And in 1992, there was even an attempt by the military to overthrow the IMF reforming government. The coup failed, but the person who became the face of that coup attempt, who served about 2 years in prison because of it, became a celebrity. He became a hero to many people, and his name was Hugo Chavez. The movement that supports the ideas of Hugo Chavez is called Chavismo. And in 1998, because Venezuela is a democracy, Hugo Chavez was able to win the presidency by promising to reverse the IMF reforms and create a new constitution democratically. And after becoming president, as promised, Hugo Chavez freed Venezuela's balls from the IMF's grip and reversed the gains the World Trade System had made in his country. He wanted the resources of Venezuela to benefit Venezuelans. In November of 2001, Hugo Chavez signed 49 laws that made the market less free to operate as it pleased in Venezuela. One of the laws that caused the World Trade System and the multinationals it served the most outrage was the law of hydrocarbons, which increased the taxes that the fossil fuel companies had to pay, which, is the cut of profits that is reserved for Venezuelans. Well, the fossil fuel companies had to go from paying 1% of their money to Venezuela to 33.33%, one of the highest, if not the highest, royalty rates in the world, which according to the Library of Congress is still the tax rate for the profiteers today. And as you can imagine, the multinational fossil fuel companies that have our country and the world trade system by the balls would much rather pay Venezuelans only 1% or 0% if they can pull it off. But 1% for Venezuelans and the rest for shareholders is the better scenario for the multinationals than Chavez and Maduro's regimes have required. They've been requiring 33.33%. And to my no-agenda brethren, I'm hearing it too. 33 is the magic number. I am totally hearing it right now. You are not alone. But 33.3%. The point I'm trying to make is that the multinationals had to go from giving 1% of the money it made from Venezuelan oil to the Venezuelans to a third of its money to Venezuela. And that is one rule that they want to rip up, that they want to deregulate. But in order to do that, a new president has to be installed. Because this guy, Chavez, and his Chavismos were not on the multinational side. Obviously, they couldn't be bought, and so they had to be eliminated. And so 6 months after those 49 laws were signed, there was an attempted coup d'etat. This was an attempted coup d'etat to overthrow Hugo Chavez, and it was a coup planned in partnership with the George W. Bush administration, an administration we all know was dominated by multinational fossil fuel industry titans, many of whom are back in charge of our government today. And so on April 11th, 2002, 18 people died during an anti-government protest that led to Hugo Chavez being removed from power by essentially being kidnapped by members of the military, his military, not ours, and flown by helicopter out of the capital. For 48 hours, the government was then led instead by the obviously unelected Petro Carmon, the head of Venezuela's largest business association, who immediately dissolved the Venezuelan Congress and the Supreme Court and canceled the Venezuelan Constitution, which had been democratically created as promised by Hugo Chavez in 1999. But 2 days later, Chavez was back in power and the Congress, Supreme Court, and Constitution were back in action with him. Technically, the coup worked, and we got to see what they were trying to do. They wanted to replace Chavez with a businessman, but it was short-lived. As for our country's involvement in this, we know for sure that about 200 members of the W. Bush administration knew beforehand that this coup was going to occur, and the State Department, including the creepy-ass National Endowment for Democracy that I geeked out on in the last episode, well, they were funneling money to the people involved in the coup. And so in April of 2002, there was a failed coup by force. And so 8 months later, there was an economic warfare coup that was tried. On December 2nd, 2002, the opposition, knowing that Chavez's government programs were funded heavily by fossil fuel profits, well, they sabotaged the Venezuelan oil company for 63 days. It started when the opposition called for a national strike on December 2nd, 2002, during which they announced that the goal of the strike would be to get Hugo Chavez, the democratically elected president, to resign. It was crystal clear that regime change was the goal. And during those 63 days, the anti-government people broke over 1,000 oil wells, something that apparently they still haven't completely fixed. And these people also sabotaged the technology controlling the oil production, essentially shutting it down by using hidden modems, the phone and internet systems, and by straight up destroying databases needed to keep the operations running. Again, the reason they did this as part of their clear and stated mission to get Chavez to resign is that the profits of the state oil company were being used instead of taxes to fund government programs like their healthcare system for all, their education system, their program that builds small affordable houses for the middle and lower classes. All those programs were being funded by oil money. And so they figured that the destruction of the oil industry would cut off the government funding enough that it would cripple the economy, stop those services, and then the people in the military would blame that on Chavez, the public would turn against him and force him to go. And the oil company sabotage did hurt the economy and the Venezuelan people. The sabotage cost the Venezuelan oil company, and therefore the government, over $14 billion over the 2 months that this went on for. But Chavez didn't resign. Instead, he fired the people who did this from the oil company, which seems fair. So 2 regime change attempts happened in 1 year, one violent, one economic, both done by the people who wanted the private companies to be allowed to own Venezuela's oil again. And so seeing who his enemy enemies were, Hugo Chavez not only withdrew from the world trade system, shutting out the private oil market, the private banking market, the private telecom market, and cutting off relations entirely with the International Monetary Fund, but he also encouraged others to do the same. He became a sworn, vocal, and effective enemy of the world trade system, and he was making friends. And this is the point where our governments, or the State Department, I should say in particular, made it very clear that they planned to sabotage Chavez politically. In 2004, the U.S. ambassador to Venezuela laid out the W. Bush administration's 5-point strategy for Venezuela and shared it with other U.S. State Department officials around the world. Now, I'm reading this 5-point strategy from a cable that was classified as secret, but then published for us by the angels at WikiLeaks. And so the focus of the State Department strategy was 1, quote, strengthening democratic institutions, unquote, so interfering in their democracy. 2, quote, penetrating Chavez's political base, unquote, so inserting moles into the groups supporting Hugo Chavez. It also included, quote, dividing Chavismo, unquote, which means getting those moles to get Chavez's supporters to fight with one another. We also were, quote, protecting vital U.S. business, unquote, and that one speaks for itself. And then finally, our strategy was, quote, isolating Chavez internationally, unquote, so basically getting his friends to stop speaking to him. So the violent coup failed, the economic warfare failed, and the political warfare, well, the W. Bush administration tried them all, and none of them worked. And Chavez kept going. So in 2007, 3 years after that cable, Chavez renegotiated contracts for 4 giant oil projects in Venezuela in order to ensure Venezuela would have the majority shares as opposed to the multinational corporations having them. And the new contracts required increased tax payments from oil companies profiting from Venezuelan oil. Most companies renegotiated the contracts or came to some kind of settlement agreement with Venezuela, but some refused, including ExxonMobil, which wanted to maintain their control of 2 of those oil development projects, and also ConocoPhillips, who refused to renegotiate and pulled out of Venezuela as well. Instead of accepting less in profit and renegotiating with the government that was choosing to use oil profits to fund services for Venezuelans, these oil companies decided instead to pull out and sue Venezuela in the World Trade System courts, specifically the World Bank's International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. That is the World Trade System's main investor-state dispute settlement court. Basically, these judicial systems allow corporations to sue governments for money if those governments enact laws that negatively affect corporate profits, and the companies get taxpayer-funded settlements for those lost profits when they win. Taxpayers are not permitted to know how much the companies are demanding during the tribunals, which are judged by 3 rotating corporate lawyers. And taxpayers have no role in the World Trade System judicial system except that we pay the corporations when they win. We don't get to sit on juries that don't exist. Like I said, the World Trade System is not a democratic system, which if you can retain no other piece of information about it, retain that. Because so much of what the World Trade System pushers do, they do in the name of democracy, despite the fact that the World Trade System itself is not democratic at all. And the World Trade System has a bunch of these investor-state dispute settlement system courts that exist to ensure fairness and freedom to multinational corporations. And so, instead of renegotiating contracts or settlements with Venezuela when the country decided to take and use its oil wealth for its people, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips sued Venezuela in a World Trade System court instead. In fact, they're suing in more than one of these courts. These corporate courts have popped up all over the world with every new trade agreement like herpes. And get this, one of the ways that they were able to sue Venezuela in more than one World Trade System court was to pretend to be Dutch. The way they did this is that ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, companies frequently labeled as American, well, they shifted money to their branches in the Netherlands, and now as investors from the Netherlands, they used a trade agreement between the Netherlands and Venezuela to sue Venezuela in one of these courts for a combined $42 billion in Venezuelan tax dollars. A lawyer who routinely argues for Venezuela in these cases called this move, quote, the Dutch sandwich, unquote. She said, quote, you put a Dutch holding in the middle of your company chain and you can call yourself Dutch, unquote. So 2 things here. 1, this is the type of nonsense that is counted as fair in this system. And 2, this just shows you that multinationals are stateless. They're not American. And ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips sure as hell aren't Dutch, and we all know it. But the World Trade System is unfair enough to allow this to happen. And as for the results of the suits, ConocoPhillips less than 2 months ago was awarded $2 billion by the court operated by the International Chamber of Commerce, which is as corporate a name as I could ever think of. And the suit in the granddaddy of all corporate courts, the World Bank's court, is still ongoing. Venezuela, for its part, is refusing to pay ConocoPhillips, and now ConocoPhillips is trying to seize Venezuelan facilities outside of Venezuela. It's a mess. And as for ExxonMobil, this one's interesting. The ISDS court originally awarded ExxonMobil $1.6 billion, which is much less than the $10 billion they were demanding. But then last March, the court reduced that even further to just a few $100 million, as the court ruled that Venezuela's choice to nationalize their oil industry was internationally legal, and the compensation options offered to ExxonMobil were fair. So, sometimes the corporations don't win, which is nice to know. But anyway, got ahead of myself with that story there. Back to the Hugo Chavez years. In 2012, Venezuela withdrew from the World Bank's investor-state dispute settlement system because Hugo Chavez said that he didn't trust the procedures. And he shouldn't. None of us should. And I think I just told you why. And then, a year later, in 2013, Hugo Chavez died. And his report card, I do have to say, didn't suck. According to an infographic created by The Guardian the week Chavez died using the World Bank and the IMF's own data, while Chavez was president, unemployment was cut in half from 14.5% to 7.6%. Extreme poverty was dramatically reduced from 23.4% when he became president to 8.5% when he died. And as far as health is concerned, infant mortality rates decreased from 20 dead babies per 1,000 births to 13, and then life expectancy for everyone increased by 2 years. The only real negatives during his time as president were inflation, but fine. As far as quality of life measures, more people had jobs and income, way fewer people were living in extreme poverty, and more babies were surviving with the investments in their healthcare system, to which everyone had affordable access to. In fact, all Venezuelans were living longer due to the healthcare system paid in large part by fossil fuel profits. Speaking as a peasant, that's not a failure for the population as a whole. But 2013, he died, Chavez was gone, and before he died, he handpicked a bus driver named Nicolas Maduro to be his successor. But because it was never a dictatorship, there was an election, and Maduro won the month after Chavez died. And this is the point where I fucked up the story the last time. So this is what I said. Now, this guy is a lot like Chavez in policy. He's not welcoming the private companies back into Venezuela. He's not setting them free in his market. But he's not like Chavez in process. This Maduro guy does appear to be more dictatorial. And I say this because in late 2015, there was an election for the Venezuelan equivalent of Congress, their National Assembly. And the other party, so the party that Maduro is not a part of, they won 2/3 of the seats. And his reaction, instead of just dealing with the fact that they'd have a divided government politically, well, his reaction was to rig some Supreme Court assignments, and then that Supreme Court basically canceled the National Assembly. Just like, poof, you don't exist anymore. It's like if the Democrats took both houses of Congress in November, and then Trump got the Supreme Court to rule that Congress no longer exists, It's a major, major constitutional crisis, and it's a dick move. And then last year, almost exactly a year ago, elections were held for a new Congress. But a lot of Venezuelans didn't participate in that vote because they consider the National Assembly to still be their Congress. And so, Venezuela truly is a mess right now politically. And that's wrong. Hearing that again is not an oversimplification. It's just wrong. But, that's the conventional wisdom. Here's Senator Marco Rubio last July in a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing.
Imagine if the United States had an executive branch that basically took over the Supreme Court and put political cronies on it, canceled all funding and all function of the Congress, both House and Senate, went further and actually ordered the Capitol Police to attack the United States Congress if we tried to conduct our functions, cut off all operations, no salaries, no paper, no ink, nothing, no lights in terms of being able to meet. In essence, completely wiped out and elect the National Assembly under the Constitution of that country. Imagine further if they announced we're not holding elections. We're not holding elections this year for governors and the legislative branch. We're not holding elections in the future for president. In fact, we're going to put together this fraudulent assembly, and we are going to impose a Cuban-style dictatorship under the guise of some sort of popular governance. That is the situation in Venezuela.
And that is also wrong. And so here's what I found out since the last episode. In late 2015, there was an election for the National Assembly, which is the Venezuelan Congress, in which the people who were not Chavismos, so not in the same party as President Maduro, won a majority of the seats. During the lame duck session of their Congress, the outgoing Congress, made up of Chavismos, filled the vacancies of 13 retiring judges out of 32 judges on the Supreme Court, which they were allowed to do even if it was a dick move to not wait until the newly elected Congress was sworn in. Just like how Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and friends refused to seat President Obama's Supreme Court pick and then quickly approved Trump's for that seat. It's a total dick move, but it was allowed. Now, the Venezuelan Supreme Court, with the new judges, then refused to seat 4 lawmakers after the start of the new Congress. 3 of the people that were not allowed to be seated were from the opposition, and 1 was a Chavismo. All of them were from the same state. And the reason that the Supreme Court said that they couldn't serve in Congress was because of voting irregularities in their districts. The effect of this ruling was that the members of the opposition were denied a supermajority in their Congress. And I don't know if this was on purpose or not. The world traders are saying it definitely was, that the Supreme Court is packed with cronies and made this ruling to help their guy, President Maduro. And I don't know if that's true, but the point is that the Supreme Court in Venezuela affected the results of a congressional election, kind of like how our Supreme Court stopped the voting recount in Florida and anointed George W. Bush to the presidency. But here's the part of the story that I didn't realize. Unlike here in the United States, when the Supreme Court interfered in our election and W. Bush just became president, Al Gore respected their ruling. Well, in Venezuela, the National Assembly ignored the Venezuelan Supreme Court ruling and sat the questionable representatives anyway, and then started the Venezuelan version of the impeachment process against President Maduro, which means that the National Assembly was essentially breaking the law by defying the Supreme Court every time one of those lawmakers took a vote. Over the course of the next year and a half, the Supreme Court took away more and more power from the National Assembly on the grounds that the National Assembly was operating with people who shouldn't have been there, rendering the Assembly itself invalid. The Supreme Court also blocked every law passed by the National Assembly since there were people voting who weren't supposed to be there. This is what is being branded as Maduro dissolving Congress. But 1, it wasn't Maduro, it was the Supreme Court. And 2, that Congress had been defying a Supreme Court ruling for years by allowing people to vote who weren't allowed to. And the back and forth between the National Assembly and the Supreme Court just kept getting nastier and nastier. For example, the Supreme Court took away the National Assembly's ability to control the finances of the country, and then the National Assembly responded by trying to replace the entire Supreme Court, which the Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional. And so everyone was being sneaky and disingenuous, and it was a clear constitutional crisis, which is why in early 2017, Maduro initiated the process to write a new constitution. The rules they had in the Constitution were not working. There was a crisis because their Constitution was not working. And so Maduro's solution was to write a new Constitution. And this was constitutional. The Venezuelan Constitution was written in 1999 when, fulfilling a campaign promise, Hugo Chavez started the process of creating the new Constitution. Millions of Venezuelans had meetings to choose what they wanted in it. They combined all those ideas, and in the end, they had a nationwide election during which the Constitution was approved by an overwhelming majority of people who showed up to vote. Over 70% of voters voted for this Constitution. And in that 1999 Venezuelan Constitution, Article 347 to be exact, it gives the president and others the power to call a national constituent assembly for the purpose of, quote, transforming the state, creating a new judicial order, and drawing up a new constitution, unquote. And so, in 2017, that's what President Nicolas Maduro did. He convened a national constituent assembly, which is allowed by the Venezuelan Constitution, to rewrite the Venezuelan Constitution, which may or may not have been a good move. You know, the Chavismos, the people that supported Chavez and his movement and who are, at least in theory at this point, on Maduro's side, they loved the 1999 Constitution, and it was democratically created. So I don't know if, rewriting it is the right thing to do. But the thing you need to understand is that it is allowed for sure, and doing this is not some dictatorial move. And here's how the process works. So an election is held to elect 545 delegates to be on the National Constituent Assembly who will write the new Constitution. When electing those delegates, the candidates run as individuals, not as members of political parties, which, by the way, is essentially my dream for the United States, as we all know what a system controlled by two powerful parties corrupted by corporations looks like. Some of the delegates are picked based on geography, so picked by district basically, and the rest are picked by 8 different economics groups: workers, students, indigenous people, employers, disabled, seniors, farmers, and fishermen. And so on July 30th, 2017, the Venezuelans had an election to choose the members of the Constituent Assembly, which are rewriting the Constitution of Venezuela right now. The way the election turned out, though, is that Maduro's party won damn near all of the seats. Why? Because the opposition, the anti-Maduro people, boycotted the vote, which predictably led to the Maduro people dominating, because that's what happens when you don't vote. Your side doesn't win. And unfortunately, there are widespread reports, even from people on Maduro's side, suggesting that the election wasn't counted entirely fairly, even though they're saying that even if it was, he probably would have won anyway because the opposition didn't show up. So, doing this was completely unnecessary. But there were a lot of safeguards, such as paper ballot backups in their electronic voting machines and ID checks, things that we haven't even implemented to protect our own elections here in the States. But those have been normal in Venezuela since 2004, and those were eliminated in the election that created the powerful Constitution rewriting Constituent Assembly. So there is cause for concern when it comes to the integrity of their elections. But what we were told at the time by disingenuous regime change advocates like Senator Marco Rubio and media outlets controlled by billionaires like the Washington Post, which is owned by Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, we were told that this was all a way for Maduro to change the Constitution in order to postpone or cancel the 2018 presidential election and become a dictator, which didn't happen. A presidential election happened as scheduled on May 20th of this year, just a couple weeks ago. And so I was wrong, and honestly lazy, to make it seem like a straight-up dictatorial move. It was much more complicated than that. The Supreme Court nullified the National Assembly because the National Assembly allowed people to vote who weren't supposed to, and they did this in violation of a Supreme Court ruling. The rewrite of the Constitution is allowed by their Constitution, and the way that it started was the proper way. Elections in Venezuela are still happening. For example, in October 2017, as determined by the newly elected Constituent Assembly, regional elections were held to elect the governors, even though people here in the States were saying those elections had been canceled. They weren't. And like I said, there was a Venezuelan presidential election just a few weeks ago. The government in Venezuela right now is changing, and the process is definitely not smooth and, verifiable for being legit. There are big problems. But it's not a black and white case of this guy is a dictator, the end. It's far, far more complicated than that, and we are only being told half the story by our corporate media, which we can never forget is funded by the companies that want to get into Venezuela in order to profit from the world's largest oil supply. Remember that. Every single time you see a TV commercial or a print ad for ExxonMobil or ConocoPhillips or BP or Shell or Chevron, those are the customers of television journalists and nationwide newspaper editors. You are not the customer. But as far as this independent podcast is concerned, I didn't look into any of this deep enough for the last episode, and I am sorry. I was in a rush, and I learned a lesson. I promise I will at least try to never do that again. But I also want to take a quick minute here and read you a note from one of our financial contributors, one of the people who make this listener-supported podcast possible, and therefore is someone I listen to. And I usually do this. I read these notes at the end of every podcast, but this one belongs in the serious segment of this episode. This is a note from Sarah Downer, one of our Patreon supporters. She said, "Hi, Jet. I just finished listening to the most recent episode of Congressional Dish. I really love the show, and I'm happy to support it. I started listening about 4 episodes ago, and I've listened to some of the past ones too. However, something bothered me a bit about the Venezuela segment. First of all, I love that you're bringing attention to the fact that established U.S. policy is to attempt regime change, either openly or covertly, whenever another country's policies are inconvenient for us. 2 great resources on that, which you've probably read, I haven't seen all the show notes pages, are Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA and Enemies, and A History of the FBI, both by Tim Weiner. They have really opened my eyes to this reality, and I appreciate that you're bringing that out as well. And to answer your question, I am listening to the audio version of Legacy of Ashes. I'm in the mid-1980s right now, and I didn't know that there was a history of the FBI book, so thank you for telling me that. But yeah, the Legacy of Ashes, I can tell you for sure, tells you in so much detail our history of regime change. It actually, it gets a little boring after a while because there's been so many of them. But back to Sarah's note, she said, so in general, I'm totally with you. However, I think it would be great if next time you talked about our policy of regime change, you also talked a little bit about how complicated the issue becomes when the destabilization of the country in question, whether because of the U.S. in whole, in part, or not, causes the scale of human suffering that we see in Venezuela. That is when the waters get really muddy. And I agree with you that it's not the U.S.'s job to decide what the future of government in Venezuela could or should be. But I believe that we have to have some role in relieving suffering and empowering the citizens to start rebuilding some system of government. The fact that neoliberal/neoconservative ideologies are generally embedded in all of those efforts, a huge problem, that doesn't relieve us of our obligation. So it's complicated, and I don't know what to do about it, but I do think the fact that there are people starving in Venezuela and citizens dying of illnesses that would be simple to cure because of a lack of basic medications and electrical failures in hospitals has to be named whenever we're talking about it. I think a lot about this as I see the situation at our own border, and I'm shocked at the horrors our government is inflicting on people who put their feet on U.S. soil. If the policies of this administration get more aggressive and authoritarian, and I think they will, I would want other countries to help us. Thanks for reading, Sarah. Well, first of all, thank you for writing, Sarah. And here's the first thing that I thought when you mentioned people dying from electrical failures in hospitals. I immediately thought of Puerto Rico, not Venezuela. And Puerto Rico is the United States. And so the first thing I would say is I would like my tax money to go towards solving these problems here in the United States, as Puerto Ricans are American citizens that also pay into this system and are not getting the proper return on our investment. So our obligation, as far as our resources and tax money are concerned, should be spent first on getting our own affairs in order. And our government services and our own democracy are currently a hot mess. And so there's that. But as far as the suffering of Venezuelans is concerned, I don't exactly know how to say this. But as far as the suffering of the Venezuelans, and I'm sure that some people in Venezuela are suffering, just like the people who live in tents under the highway 2 miles from where I live are suffering. I'm sure those situations exist in Venezuela too, as they do all over the world. But I think we may be viewing the Venezuelan suffering as a bigger problem than it is because it's being repeated so often. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is from March 2017. This is Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico in the hearing about Venezuela.
I didn't vote in favor of increased sanctions against Venezuela. I thought then and I believe now they're counterproductive and could lead to further entrenchment of the current Venezuelan regime, and that's exactly what happened. The Venezuelan people, many who oppose the government, are suffering. They're going without food, without medicine, without power, without the essentials.
Now, I did isolate that particular clip to make this point for a Regina George-like reason, because doesn't it seem ridiculous that some New Mexico bumpkin who can't even say Venezuela should have any role whatsoever in shaping our relationship with Venezuela? And I think this is a good example of someone not knowing what the hell they're talking about, because he can't even say the fucking name. So when he's telling us that there are all these people suffering and they're going without food and without medicine, without power, without the essentials, I don't know if this is a trustworthy source of information. And if you think I'm being harsh, come on, Jen, give the guy a break. He flubbed his words once, and you, Miss Briney, you flub him all the time. I hear that, but this wasn't a fluke.
Mr. Smildy, are you clear that taking a hardline approach to Venezuela will likely lead to a Cubanization of our policies there? Dr. O'Neill, would you agree that in Venezuela, different factions now view the situation as a zero-sum game? As to Venezuela, can you outline what role you think the Foreign Relations Committee or others should take to encourage a multilateral effort to ensure that elections are held in 2018 and to prevent a Cubanization of policies in Venezuela?
This guy's sitting there for 3 hours? He's heard everyone say the name of the country, but Venezuela. So retarded. And I know I'm not supposed to say retarded anymore, but I don't care. He's retarded. It's a word that I'm not yet ready to give up. I love that word. But anyway, the point is that here he is saying that the Venezuelans are
without food, without medicine, without power, without the essentials.
And I haven't been to Venezuela, so I can't be sure, but I have serious doubts about the claims, because they're being claimed by people, first of all, that I just don't think have done any research. I don't think this guy has gone there. He's clearly not. They don't know. And also because keeping in mind that aid and loans, that's what's used by the World Trade System to get countries to change their economic laws. You know, that's always a part of the plan for getting countries integrated into the World Trade System. And so the ulterior motive that they would have for lying, to say like these people really need aid, that motive is there. And last summer, a few months after that hearing took place, when Udall and many others were plotting the regime change, and I'm going to play you more clips from that hearing in a minute, but at the same time that these claims of starving people are being made all over the place, well, on the July 11th, 2017 episode of her show, The Empire Files, Abby Martin went to Venezuela to find out for herself what was going on there on the ground. And full disclosure, The Empire Files is aired now on Telesur, which is a channel that is funded by a group of Latin American governments, including Venezuela. But also, full disclosure, I've met Abby Martin. We were on a panel together the last time I was on The Young Turks, and I got to spend about a half hour chatting with her before we went on the air. And my impression of her is that I found a kindred spirit. You know, she's a fiercely independent journalist, and I truly believe that if Venezuelan officials, even the one who signs her checks, told her that she has to say anything, she'd tell them to go f*** themselves. But she's also friendly and artistic and shockingly normal and funny, despite the fact that she is a journalistic badass, taking chances that I'm simply too afraid to take. You know, it was one thing for me to go to Puerto Rico after the hurricane for a workcation, but Abby went to Gaza to see what's happening there for herself. And she also, like I said, went to Venezuela. And so in her July 11th, 2017 episode, the one she personally recommended to me to help me understand what's happening on the ground, here's what she discovered about the claim that Venezuelans are starving.
Venezuelans are experiencing food shortages, with the majority of people saying they eat less and worse now than in recent years. The lines that people wait hours in are not simply to buy food in general. They're mostly to buy bread, due to the scarcity of flour. But with so many claims of empty shelves, I went to several supermarkets around the city with a hidden camera.
And here she is. There's a bunch of beans, canned goods, vegetables, Hello Cheetos, Captain Crunch. I mean, there's food everywhere.
So we just went to about 5 different supermarkets, and the shelves were fully stocked. And this is all types of neighborhoods, all types of classes. The shelves were stocked with everything from Nestle chocolate, all Coca-Cola products, fish, meat, vegetables, fruit. Although it is true, I did not find toilet paper at any of the stores. There's a multitude of other paper products, from Kleenex to paper towels to napkins. So while it is true that there are shortages, it seems like you are very able to find things for everyday life, no problem.
And then on top of that, another source that I use to see what people on the ground are saying is TripAdvisor. And no one is complaining on TripAdvisor about not being able to eat or access medicines or hospitals, which I imagine tourists would be upset about. In fact, I saw multiple people on TripAdvisor saying the portrayal of Venezuela as a dangerous place with no food and healthcare is false and should be ignored. And so that's why I just don't trust the depiction of life in the country that is being repeated a lot, because it doesn't match what Abby saw and recorded on the ground. And it doesn't match what tourists are saying on TripAdvisor, you know? Venezuela is not Yemen. Go to the Yemen page, and the advice from the mainland is just don't go there. And that's not at all what is being said on the Venezuelan pages. The biggest obstacle to enjoying yourself on the Venezuelan TripAdvisor is dealing with the currency. But there's also a lot of tips on how to exchange your dollars and get everything you need, including medicine and quality health care, by exchanging your cash in the black market. And actually, it's a pretty fascinating rabbit hole to go down just to see how people are dealing with this and how they're talking about, you know, the way that they deal with getting cash. And it seems quite complicated. It's pretty nuts. But by all accounts, it seemed trustworthy. It appears that food itself is not hard to find in Venezuela, but instead it's certain products that are scarce. And it appears that private companies are holding back some essential products. And why would they do that? Well, it's a play out of a very old playbook, you know? Private companies did this in the 1970s in Chile as a way to sabotage the economy to hurt President Salvador Allende, who we ended up eventually regime changing. And so we know that creating supply shortages is in the regime change playbook because we've done it before. And by we, I mean the multinational corporations. At this point, my government and the multinational corporations are one and the same. That's why I keep saying we. But as far as the general food scarcity is concerned, the problem, like I said, isn't necessarily that there's no food. The restaurants are open, there's food, but the currency has inflated so much that it's become unaffordable for some people to buy some of the products. And as far as the inflated currency is concerned, the inflation rate is all tied to Venezuelans' money's rate in relation to the U.S. dollar. So we do have some opportunities for free there, but I can't tell you what they are because I don't know, and that was a rabbit hole I didn't feel like going down. But one part of the story that we are not being told is that the Maduro government is not just doing nothing about it. Along with the currency inflation, the government has been raising the minimum wage over and over again. In fact, as of May 2017, the government had hiked the minimum wage 15 times. And so I understand what Sarah's saying, and I'm sure, without a doubt, that, Sarah, I bet you are a very good person and you don't want anyone to suffer. And I think that's why the propaganda is designed this way, you know? They're counting on us wanting to help. And I appreciate that perspective. But if there's one thing that I've learned in this research, it's that we are being bullshitted when it comes to Venezuela. At the very least, we are being told only one side of the Venezuelan story. We are being told that everything is horrible in Venezuela and that the government is doing absolutely nothing, and that's just not true. You know, the Maduro government is a continuation of Chavismo, which is based on the government doing far more than our government, our free market government, to provide economic security to the population, especially for the poor and the suffering. You know, it's not freedom for the market there. It's not freedom for private companies at all. These companies are allowed in the country, but only as long as they agree to Venezuela's terms and share a significant amount of the profits with the Venezuelan people. Remember, the deal that oil companies got in the late 80s from the guy who was implementing the World Trade System reforms was a 1% share of oil revenue for the Venezuelan people. The Chavismos changed that to 33.33%. And the Venezuelan government keeps raising the minimum wage. And who pays that? The companies. The regulations of the Maduro government are costing the companies money. And so the people who want a new free market government that will change the terms back in the multinationals' favor, well, they're trying to convince us that Venezuela's economic model is a disaster and that it doesn't work at all. But with that 1/3 of a share of the fossil fuel money, the Chavez administration created programs to teach students music and art so that in Venezuela, artists don't have to starve. They also have housing projects that have built over 1.5 million affordable homes for the poor. Here, I can tell you, our poor people live in tents under the freeway, if they're lucky enough to get a tent. As far as education is concerned, the number of people in school doubled since Chavismo started. And college attendance, due to the government providing higher education, has increased 7 times. Chavismo's also increased pensions for retired people, which contributed to a huge drop in extreme poverty rates. I told you, it went from like 20-something to 8. As far as healthcare is concerned, infant mortality dropped in half. But here's the thing, the new guy, Maduro, he took over right when the oil price crashed. And so now they're struggling to fund all this, especially since their government is so dependent on money from oil sales, and they can't seem to get their currency under control. But if they could make this work, they might inspire other governments to use taxes to provide basic needs to their people instead of allowing private companies to do literally everything for a profit, which is an idea of the World Trade System. You know, the idea that you use these industries to fund government instead of profits, this is not an idea that can be allowed to spread. Here's Senator Bob Menendez. This is a Democrat. This is part of the resistance who's been sanctioned by Venezuela. This guy is not allowed to step foot in Venezuela because of his clear regime change goals. Well, here's Senator Bob Menendez in his opening statement in the March 2017 hearing about Venezuela in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Even as their president prevents international support for the basic humanitarian needs of its citizens, blocking an effort by the National Assembly to facilitate international assistance, they are voting to demand fundamental freedoms. Despite the suffering of his people and the international outcry, Maduro insists on clinging on to the shreds of a failed ideology his predecessor and a few colleagues in the region still champion.
You know, this isn't about Nicolas Maduro. This is about the way they are structuring their government, and it goes back to Chavez. It's not the men, it's the socialism. It's the economic system that doesn't adhere to the World Trade System rules based on freedom for multinational corporations. And so I think we are, and have been for a while, targets of a propaganda campaign preparing us for a regime change. And now I'm going to prove it to you. As I saw this hearing, I've played you some of the clips already, but this March 2017 hearing, this is where the steps were planned. And the committee to watch in Congress for information on the Venezuelan regime changes progress is definitely the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, because last March there was this off C-SPAN hearing. And so this was a hearing that was not aired on television anywhere in the United States. And in this hearing, they clearly discussed strategies for replacing Venezuela's government, and now we're seeing what they discussed happening in real time. And of course, I have the highlights for you. So, to understand what they are talking about in many of these clips, you first need to know what the Organization of American States is, or OAS. That's how they refer to it. We first learned about the OAS in the episode I did about the World Trade Organization, where I played the clips of the creepy world leaders who created the World Trade System, discussing their plot to have the entire world adhere to their economic system. And sitting at that table was one of the first officials at the Organization of American States when it was created, along with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund right after World War II. So this is a big part of the World Trade System. It's an organization made up of the Latin American World Trade System countries. And in this clip I'm about to play for you, you're going to hear this lady say something about the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which was adopted on September 11th, 2001. In this document, it says, quote, the peoples of the Americans have, and I'm not saying that the fact that it was adopted on 9/11, like actual 9/11, was some kind of like conspiracy. Like, I don't have any reason to think that at all. It kind of took me aback where I was like, wait, this was signed on 9/11? Like, what the f***? You can't put the vote off a day considering it's like 9/11? So I just found that super weird that was the day that 9/11, I don't know. Anytime 9/11 comes up, we all just kind of go like, But anyway, in the Inter-American Democratic Charter signed on 9/11, it says, quote, the peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy, and their governments have an obligation to promote and defend it, unquote. All right? This is all about democracy. And then it says, quote, when the special session of the General Assembly determines that there has been an unconstitutional interruption of the democratic order of a member state and that diplomatic initiatives have failed, the special session shall take the decision to suspend that member from the exercise of its right to participate in the OAS by an affirmative vote of 2/3 of the member states in accordance with the charter of the OAS. The suspension shall take effect immediately. It also says, quote, notwithstanding the suspension of the member state, the organization will maintain diplomatic initiatives to restore democracy in that state, unquote. So regardless of the fact that the country would no longer be a member of the OAS would still be able to operate in that country to change the government into whatever they consider democracy. And so invoking the Inter-American Democratic Charter is essentially the process for kicking a country out of the OAS and letting the OAS do whatever it does to shape that country's government into, again, their definition of democracy. So, now that you know that, here is Dr. Shannon O'Neill. She is from the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a World Trade System thing that we've talked about many times. But she's from the Council on Foreign Relations, and she is giving advice to our Congress last March.
Multilateral initiatives are perhaps more important and potentially more fruitful as a means to influence Venezuela. Now, this will mean working behind the scenes to galvanize opposition and condemnation for the Maduro regime. This will be more effective than U.S. efforts alone, as it will be much harder for the Venezuelan government to dismiss the criticisms and the actions of its South American neighbors as imperialist overreach. And such a coalition is much more possible today than in any time in the recent past, due both to the accelerating repression and the breaking of the last democratic norms in Venezuela, and due to the very different stances of South America's recently elected leaders, particularly in Peru, in Brazil, and in Argentina. The OAS remains a venue and an instrument to focus these efforts. The U.S. should call on the organization to again invoke the Inter-American Charter, to evaluate Venezuela's democratic credentials and its compliance with them. And this could lead potentially to sanctions and suspension of Venezuela from this multilateral body.
So a couple of things here. First, did you guys catch the opening of that rabbit hole? Because this lady from the Council on Foreign Relations said that getting the OAS to work with the U.S. efforts is going to be easier because of new leaders in Peru, Brazil, and Argentina. And I don't have time to learn about 3 more countries today, but if you guys know things, please send links to @JenBriney on Twitter, because what has gone down recently in Peru, Brazil, and Argentina? I don't know. But more importantly, her advice is to invoke the 9/11 Charter to kick Venezuela out of the OAS, which would allow the OAS to do their thing to restore democracy. And expanding on that idea was Senator Ben Cardin, again, a Democrat, member of the Resistance of Maryland, talking to Mark Fierstein, who is a former State Department official in the Clinton years and special assistant to President Obama, who now works at the war planning think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and who is also a senior advisor for Madeleine Albright's company that advises multinational corporations how to make money around the world, the Albright-Stonebridge Group. Here is their conversation.
We looked at ways in which we can change the direction here, and it starts with the governance. When you have a corrupt government, it's going to be very difficult to see international organizations willing to come in to help refinance their economy. Even though they have wealth, it's going to be difficult to figure out how that takes place unless they have basic changes in the way their government's doing business. And we don't see any indication that that's taking place. So you've made a couple suggestions. One is that we need to work with our regional partners, which I fully agree. So let's start with OAS, which is the entire region, as to whether it's realistic that the democratic charter provisions can in fact lead to change in Venezuela. Ultimately, it will require us to have the threat of at least two-thirds of the countries if we're going to be able to invoke the charter with some teeth. What is the likelihood that OAS could be effective as a real force in bringing about change by the Maduro government? Mr. Fierstein?
Well, thank you very much for that question. And actually, if I can hit on your two other points as well. First, with regard to humanitarian assistance, under the Obama administration, USAID, in fact, did put together a contingency plan to provide assistance if, in fact, even when the Venezuelan government is willing to receive it. And USAID has a warehouse in Miami and is prepared to provide assistance. I know international organizations are prepared as well. There has been some dialogue between the government and the American Development Bank with regard to economic reform, though frankly at fairly lower levels, and there's no indication that at senior levels that they're inclined at serious attempts at economic reform.
So that's them talking about the strength. The World Trade System Bank is ready to give them money, but there's, quote, no indication at senior levels that they're going to do any of the economic reform. Hence, that's the need for the new government.
With regard to the OAS, I think that we're much better positioned now than we were a couple of years ago. And that's because of some changes in some key governments in the region, Argentina, Peru, Brazil. There was a reference to Ecuador, potential change there.
Heads up, Ecuador. So let's add that one to our watch list.
As well. And I think that patience has clearly run out with Maduro. I think countries are more inclined now to take action. There has been a hesitation to do so as long as the dialogue was alive, as long as the Vatican was engaged. One of the challenges has been with regard to the Caribbean countries, which received significant petroleum assistance from Venezuela, and that has somewhat silenced them, and there's been some divisions within the Caribbean. That said, I'm hopeful that in the coming months that as the situation deteriorates in Venezuela, and as that it becomes clear that the dialogue cannot be successful unless there is more pressure. And I think there needs to be three forms of pressure. There needs to be domestic mobilization within Venezuela in the form of protests. I think there needs to be additional sanctions applied by the United States and other countries. And I think there needs to be action within the OAS, including a threat of suspension of Venezuela from the organization if it does not comply with the Inter-American Democratic Charter.
And so there they are, off of television, talking about how we need to do three things. Number one, more protests, which sounds like it should be something out of their control, but we have a long, long history, our CIA in particular, of prepping for regime changes by paying violent people to protest. Protests were a factor in Syria, where we know we've given millions of dollars, weapons, and training to the opposition. And they were also factors in Ukraine. In fact, Republican Senator John McCain and Democratic Senator Chris Murphy spoke on stage at one of those anti-government protests in Ukraine, even though this is how John McCain talks to peaceful protesters here at home.
You know, you're going to have to shut up or I'm going to have you arrested. Get out of here, you low-life scum.
Such a hypocrite. But anyway, step one are the protests, which we all know are happening. And if you watch the Empire Files, badass journalist Abby Martin went to the anti-government protests and personally witnessed the protesters setting streets on fire. So I put links to her videos in the show notes if you want to see them, but there are people raising hell in Venezuela, so step 1 is underway. And so let's look at step 2, additional sanctions by the U.S. and other countries. What's happened on that front? Well, a few months after this hearing, in August 2017, President Trump enacted new sanctions. These sanctions prevented U.S. companies and citizens from buying certain kinds of Venezuelan government debt and bonds, and also prevented companies and citizens from purchasing most securities issued by the Venezuelan government, which cuts off the Venezuelan government from sources of cash. So when you want to talk about their currency problem, that happened in August of 2017. A month after that, in September of 2017, after forming an association with the United States, Canada enacted sanctions against 54 Venezuelans, including President Maduro himself. Then on March 19, 2018, on the 15-year anniversary of the Iraq regime change, President Trump enacted more sanctions prohibiting U.S. citizens from buying any digital currency created by the Venezuelan government, because Venezuela is trying to create a new cryptocurrency to try to deal with their inflation problem and to get around the World Trade System sanctions. Then 2 months later, on May 21st, 2018, one day after President Maduro's re-election, Trump placed more sanctions on Venezuela's oil company, preventing any U.S.-based company or citizen from buying debt from the Venezuelan government or its oil company, which, by the way, the Venezuelan oil company is the owner of Citgo. And so every time you see a Citgo sign, go Red Sox, that's Venezuela's company. And then a week and a half later, Canada announced new sanctions too, freezing the access of 14 more Venezuelans. So step 2, that's happening. And then there's step 3, action within the Organization of American States to threaten Venezuela with suspension, which happened 2 weeks ago. So right after the Maduro re-election, on June 4th, our new Secretary of State, the Koch brothers' bitch, Mike Pompeo, spoke at the Organization of American States, and this is what he said.
In addition to suspension, I call on fellow member states to apply additional pressure on the Maduro regime, including sanctions and further diplomatic isolation, until such time as it undertakes the actions necessary to return to genuine democracy and provide people desperately needed access to international humanitarian aid.
You know, you would think that an organization that has a quarter of the world's countries in it could afford better microphones. But yeah, so that was Mike Pompeo on June 4th, and then the very next day, June 5th, here's Mike Pence, our vice president, speaking to Organization of American States members at the White House.
Tomorrow, the General Assembly will have the opportunity to begin the process of suspending Venezuela from membership and participation in the OAS. And so tonight, on behalf of President Trump, I call on the community of free nations from across this new world to expel the Maduro dictatorship from the Organization of American States. The OAS must stand for freedom. And now's the time.
And the vote was taken the next day. You know, the regime changers needed 24 countries to vote yes to actually suspend Venezuela, but they only got 19. And so their efforts failed this time. But it shows you that they are doing exactly what they said they would to try and get Venezuela kicked out of the OAS, which has only happened to 2 countries in the past. One was Cuba. Cuba was suspended in 1962 and then refused to rejoin when offered the chance in 2009. And then the other one was Honduras, which was temporarily suspended after a military coup. That's the military coup that Hillary Clinton was involved in and that she helped legitimize as Secretary of State by working with the OAS to set up new elections, which installed, by the way, a pro-business guy who immediately started privatizing the natural resources of Honduras. So, you know, instead of insisting that the elected Chavez-like leader be given his presidency back, that's what Hillary Clinton decided to do. And now Honduras is back in the OAS, and it voted along with the U.S. and Canada, Argentina, Peru, and Brazil, and not enough others, to kick out Venezuela. So Honduras was flipped, but Venezuela is still a work in progress. And Shannon O'Neill of the Council on Foreign Relations also had one more piece of advice.
One thing that has in the past in Venezuela brought the opposition together is elections, right, is a mechanism that you're pushing towards a particular goal. And so as we look forward for 2017, there's a party registration process that is about to begin, and there's questions about who may or may not qualify there, and if the National Electoral Committee will actually play fair in that sense. That is something that you could rally together different groups if it's seen unfair in terms of qualifications. And then we have pending elections that did not happen at the end of last year, regional elections that may or may not be put on the table. And so I think internally a push for elections, because that is a constitutional mechanism for parties to participate in democracy, and perhaps outside as well, we can be pushing for these parts. Even we know democracy is not existent there anymore, but can we push for elections? Can we push? And that's something at least to galvanize those that are not in power today.
And after President Maduro's re-election on May 20th, here's Mike Pence, our vice president, speaking to the OAS members at the White House on June 5th.
The election held 2 weeks ago was a disgrace. The regime had banned major parties, barred opposition leaders from standing for office. On Election Day itself, Maduro's henchmen engaged in widespread intimidation and illegal actions, rigging the vote to silence the people's voices and ensuring victory for the regime's failed socialist ideology.
Everything Congress was told would help make regime change happen in Venezuela has been happening. Protests, sanctions, threats from the OAS, and an election, which may or may not have been shady, but there's been no independent officials that have investigated anything, and it's only been a few weeks even if they did. But the election is definitely being used to galvanize those who are not in power in Venezuela today, meaning the world traitors. And so this regime change is in motion. But it's important to always prepare for success, and so here's Dr. Shannon O'Neill of the Council on Foreign Relations with some advice for if and when regime change comes to Venezuela.
And then finally, the United States should begin preparing for change. If the Maduro regime is forced out or it collapses, the country will likely face humanitarian, economic, and financial chaos. And there are two particular things the United States can start preparing for. The first is a wave of refugees. This will hit Venezuela's neighbors the hardest: Brazil, Colombia, Guyana, nearby Caribbean nations. It's important to help them with money, with supplies, potentially with personnel, and to back international NGOs and multilateral efforts to ease the suffering of these people. The second aspect to prepare for is a restructuring of Venezuela's finances and its economy. A new government will need to renegotiate $140 billion worth of external debt, whether or not the government has already defaulted upon it or not. And this massive undertaking will likely require an IMF rescue package and the backing of the international community and creditors. The U.S. will be vital in facilitating this, as well as in helping a new government take the tough economic policy choices to turn the economy around. These will include freeing the exchange rate, reinducing market prices, creating sustainable policies for the poor, and rooting out corruption. And those is complicated. The faster it occurs, the faster Venezuela's economy will grow again.
Tough economic policy choices. The economic law changes always required in return for World Trade System cash, and they should do it as fast as possible. You know, this recipe for regime change is remarkably consistent, and it's impossible to miss once you know to look for it. And the reason that regime change is essential to start the aid in return for economic reform process was made clear by Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, who, by the way, wrote an op-ed last month titled, quote, "It's time to hasten Maduro's exit from power," unquote.
On the USAID piece, there's a reason why we're not in there. They don't let us. The Venezuelan government does not allow open aid because they deny that there's an emergency.
And so they need to tell us that there's an emergency so that we can force the aid upon them. See what I mean? There's a reason why we need to think that there's a big emergency in Venezuela, whether there is or not. And like I said, I haven't been there, but I know someone who has, and she brought a camera. But the point I want you to walk away with is that there is a regime change effort happening right now by the world traitors in Venezuela. And it's supported by Republicans like Senator Marco Rubio and Democrats like Senator Bob Menendez, himself a corrupt son of a bitch. The only reason his ass isn't in jail for bribery is because of a hung jury. So much for the resistance. And then there's Trump, Mr.
Obviously, the war in Iraq is a big, fat mistake, all right?
But now
we have many options for Venezuela. And by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option.
And apparently he's saying the same stuff behind closed doors to little Marco.
I also know this, and I do not speak for the president, but I've certainly spoken to the president, and I will only reiterate what he has already said, and I've been saying this now for a number of days. I have 100% confidence that if democracy is destroyed once and for all in Venezuela on the 30th in terms of the Maduro regime, the President of the United States is prepared to act unilaterally in a significant and swift way. And that is not a threat. That is the reporting of the truth.
And what happened on the 30th was the vote for that constituent assembly, which we all know did happen, and they are rewriting their constitution. So that's what he's talking about. And so little Marco has 100% confidence that Trump is ready to regime change if that thing happens, and it did. And so the point of all this is that they're clearly implementing the steps that the regime changers in both parties worked on in their committee over a year ago. It's being implemented right now and before your eyes. And so keep your eyes open, because now you know what to look for.